My name is Jerry Croth, and I'm a psych professor in California, Santa Clara University. This is a talk about a book I wrote, which I'll talk about later, but it involves an experience where you see things with new eyes, where you develop a different perspective, literally and figuratively. So if you look at this picture in front of you, it looks like vertical black and white lines. Okay? Now, if you step back, develop a more global perspective, and actually step back about 4 feet, you'll see something that is embedded in that picture that you didn't see the first time you looked at it. Now, I think I can reproduce this. Take a look at this. See if you see it. Did you see anything there? One more time. All right. Okay, did you see a face embedded in that, maybe of a person that you know? So, this book requires, or this adventure that we're on, requires that you develop a different perspective. And as soon as you do, you're going to say, oh my God, I didn't know that was there. And it's really very, very good news. And you'll find it very interesting. So, we start this encounter with some rather dark subjects here because it's about war and violence and so forth. So there are two kinds of plagues. All right, let's start with that. Physical plagues and psychic plagues. Well, what is a psychic plague? Well, Carl Jung, the psychiatrist, said, to quite a terrifying degree, we are threatened by wars and revolutions, which are nothing other than psychic epidemics. So Jung saw war as like a contagion that spreads. So let's first begin our discussion with physical plagues. These are physical plagues where the immune system plays some kind of role. My book, by the way, is about the psychic immune system. We'll get to that. So the first plague is the plague of Justinian around Roman times. It killed 25 million people, about 14% of the human race. The bubonic plague, the Black Death of the 14th century, took 100 million lives, almost 60% of the entire population of Europe. Okay, it was wiped out in the space of only a few years. That's about 28% of the human race. Native American plague spread over different waves. About 24 million lost their lives, about 6% of the human race. And the Spanish flu took hold in 1918-19, taking between 25 and 75 million lives, about 4% of the population of the earth. Now, we know a little bit more about the Spanish flu because it was more recent. So I would like to give you a little bit of a clip on that subject.
One of the worst natural disasters in recorded history was caused by a virus. The influenza pandemic of 1918 struck every major U.S. city, dropping people where they stood.
There were at least 20 million people killed worldwide, and it's probably the worst pandemic the world has ever known. There were more people killed from influenza than there were from the First World War.
The war itself was the problem. Allied troops met in northern France to exchange fire with the enemy. They also exchanged a lethal strain of flu. So it began.
It then went from France to the United States and disseminated from Boston.
At Fort Devens, Massachusetts, one case of flu turned into more than 6,000 cases between September 1st and September 18th. It took only 17 days. India lost nearly 4% of its population. Alaska, 8%. In the South Seas, the death rate was 20%.
People were absolutely panicked because somebody could be playing bridge one night and they would be dead the next day.
So if you take a look at this graph that was made in that period of time, you see it rises, it crests, it falls. This is a very important graph for us because the physical immune system has something to do. This graph goes across a period of only about 9 months. So why does it decline? That is the critical question. And that's where the immune system plays a role. No one knew what viruses were until 1931. So no one knew what caused this. In the late 90s, they went to, I think it was Alaska, and they found a body buried in the tundra, preserved, and very carefully extracted some lung tissue. They discovered that the Spanish flu was really a swine flu, a very virulent form of swine flu. Now, it turns out that the people who died in the Spanish flu epidemic were between about 18 and 30. Older people seem to have an immunity, okay? And it seems that it was a variant of the swine flu went around 1899, and older people had been exposed, had developed an immunity, and were not, they did not succumb so readily to the Spanish flu. So that curve goes down into remission, primarily because of the human immune system is operating. So that's an important concept. My book is about the psychic immune system, and whether there is such a thing. Now let's take a look at psychic epidemics. Okay, these are the darkest periods, the biggest killing sprees that humanity has gone on since the time of Christ. Generally speaking, this is the major list. Genghis Khan killed 15 million people, about 5% of the human race. World War I took 16 million lives, 3.9% of Europe. The Timur dynasty came somewhat after Genghis Khan. This guy piled skulls up in minarets, killed 17 million people, 4% of the human race. World War II took 60 million lives, about 6.5% of the population of Europe. Stalinism. Now we know that World War II, there were a great number of Russians died, but how many Russians died as a result of Stalin's totalitarian iron-fistedness? So about 6 million. That's a conservative estimate. About 1.5 million who were sent to Siberia and died. A number of others who died in what is called the Holodomor, a Stalin-induced famine in the Ukraine that killed between 6 and 10 million people. There was a genocide in the Congo that was orchestrated by a man named King Leopold, which took 10 million lives, about 8% of Africa. Mao orchestrated a similar uprooting of agriculture, and something like 30 million people died in a famine in China, which occurred in just a very few years. We knew very little about it when it was happening. The Cambodian genocide, Pol Pot murdered about 1.7 million people, almost a little more than 20% of his country. The African slave trade resulted in the death of about 8 million people. So those are our biggest killing sprees and darkest moments in the last 2,000 years. So let's take a look at a couple of these moments. The Holodomor we know very little about, and the other one, the Chinese famine. I would like to explore both of those. So let's take a look at Stalinist atrocity in the Ukraine.
In 1932-33, an estimated 10 million people were deliberately starved to death in Ukraine. The Holodomor was a premeditated act of genocide perpetrated by Stalin to destroy any resistance to the communist regime. Ukrainians died at a rate of 17 per minute, 1,000 an hour, and 25,000 a day.
Що живих людей ще кидали. І коли моя мама запротестувала проти того, щоб, каже, вони ще живі, то той дядько, що збирали вони трупи, вони ледве що ходили. Я був тоді при мамі. І каже, ми не будемо другий раз возити, вертатися, розумієте, в село забирати.
So it gives you an idea why some of the Ukrainians, anyway, want to disaffiliate themselves with Russia. Now, there's another famine we know very little about, the famine in China. So here's a little clip about that.
The famine was very severe and widespread, but newspapers did not report it at all. People only knew that their local area was suffering. To keep the news from spreading, peasants were not allowed to leave their areas, even to beg.
The famine lasted 3 years. An estimated 30 million people died. Mao's revolution, fought to give the Chinese people a better life, had helped create the largest famine in history.
So, coming back to our drawing, what are we missing? We looked at these pandemics, we looked at these epidemics, they're right in front of our eyes, but is there something underneath the surface that is embedded here that we're not seeing? Okay, so here's an introduction to that, okay? Genghis Khan's reign of terror came to an end. Oh, that's kind of nice. World War I ended. Hitler's Nazism ended. Stalinism ended. Khrushchev came and emptied the gulags. It was called the Great Thaw. Maoism ended. After he died, the Gang of Four was going to take over, but they were repudiated. That included his wife. They were put in jail, and businessmen took over. Leopold's genocide ended. Pol Pot's Brave New World ended in about 3.5 years. The slave trade ended with the abolition of slavery. In other words, all of these things are ended with a happy ending. And we just simply haven't noticed it. Okay? Now, there's a book called What If? It's written by military historians and scholars. What if Hitler had won? What if this evil that he was perpetrating actually was victorious in World War II? What would have happened? Well, Hitler killed 75% of all the Jews in Europe. Okay, so what would have happened if he won? Well, he would have probably made that 100%. Don't forget that Hitler also murdered over 200,000 disabled and retarded persons during his reign of terror. So you could imagine that there would be no disabled or retarded or person or any gypsies left in all of Eurasia, most of North Africa, and he would have probably gone to Palestine and finished the job. Okay, but it didn't turn out that way. And perhaps it doesn't turn out that way for Genghis Khan or Stalin or Mao for a reason, which is what my book is about. My book is called The Psychic Immune System, a hidden epiphenomena of the physical immune system, as if the psychic immune system, it mimics the physical immune system. So let's take a look at some of these. You saw, remember our physical epidemic, the Spanish flu, and that rises, it crests, it falls, because physical immunities are involved. Well, if you look at the deaths under Stalin, they rise, they go to the labor camps, they fall, and the curves look remarkably similar. If you look at the Cambodian Holocaust under Pol Pot, the barbarity rises, crests, falls back down. Interesting. Physical epidemics take this form. They rise, they crest, they fall back down. Okay, that's what epidemiologists have discovered. But look at psychic epidemics. The deaths under Mao have this same kind of feature. I know we don't think in these terms, but there's a peak, a crest, and then remission. Once again, Pol Pot was a delusional psychotic, really. And there were people in Cambodia who, everyone in the entire country had to change their name to a monosyllabic name. No one was allowed to refer to fathers or mothers or grandfathers. These separated families. If you had a maid you would be killed. If you had a beard, if you wore glasses, if you have any education, all libraries were padlocked. Pol Pot was on an extermination auto-genocide, which wanted to replace Cambodia with a pure race of Khmers who were dedicated to utopian communism. It was Brave New World there. We didn't notice it because we didn't want to. We were not interested. We had just left Vietnam, but it was one of the greatest atrocities committed in the 20th century. Timur carried out his campaign, but notice the fatalities rise, crest, and drop off. A mathematician from Cambridge mathematically modeled diseases. You see measles there on your left. A vaccine is introduced, boom, it falls. So this mathematician tried to model the course of diseases. This is measles in Bristol and the bubonic plague in Sydney, a breakout there. And you notice the curves appear to be like bell-shaped curves, which approximate how a disease and the course of a disease flows. So the theory here is somewhat like this, that physical epidemics have this character, not all of them, but they do have this character, and the remission is caused by the physical immune system. The question asked in this book is, are our barbarities, our genocides, our world wars, our tyrannies, ISIS, do these psychic epidemics follow a similar pattern where they rise, they seem like they're never going to end, and something, is it goodness, is it humanity, but the evil comes to an end. Mahatma Gandhi said, "When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible, but in the end they always fail." Think of it, always. That's the point of this book, of this talk, and that little graphic. That's what we may be missing. So I would like to talk to you for a second about the physical immune system. Thucydides, 2,500 years ago, noticed something. He said, if a person gets sick and they get well, and another person gets sick, the person who got sick first can go and help and nurse the person who's now sick, because the person who once was sick isn't getting sick a second time. So he was noticing something. We're noticing something. Okay, he was noticing that the physical immune system exists, but he didn't know what to call it. We didn't know anything about the immune system for 2,500 years after Thucydides. Okay, then we have Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and others around 130 to 140 years ago who are slowly discovered that we have a serum inside ourselves, they called it, which heals us, which has antibodies. And now we know a great deal about how the physical immune system works. But it's pretty much invisible. We cut our hand and gradually, we don't feel it, we don't see it, we don't manifest it through consciousness. It just works. It starts to heal over the course of days, and that curve goes down. The remission occurs. Here's a little video about the immune system.
It's a beautiful day when suddenly a wild rusty nail appears and you cut yourself. The first barrier of the immune system is breached, your skin. Nearby bacteria seize on the opportunity and enter your wound. They start using up the body's resources and double their numbers about every 20 minutes. At first, they fly under the radar, but when a certain bacteria population is reached, they change their behavior and start to damage the body by changing the environment around them. The immune system has to stop them as fast as possible. First of all, your guard cells, known as macrophages, intervene. They are huge cells that guard every border region of the body. Most of the time, they alone can suffocate an attack because they can devour up to 100 intruders each. They swallow the intruder whole and trap it inside a membrane. Then the enemy gets broken down by enzymes and is killed. On top of that, they cause inflammation by ordering the blood vessels to release water into the battlefield so fighting becomes easier. You notice this as a very mild swelling. When the macrophages fight for too long, they call in heavy backup by releasing messenger proteins that communicate location and urgency. Neutrophils leave their patrol routes in the blood and move to the battlefield. The neutrophils fight so furiously that they kill healthy cells in the process. On top
Okay, so we won't go into all of the complexities of the immune system, but through the study of AIDS, we've learned a great deal about how the immune system operates, and every year we learn more and more and more. But we are, in terms of the psychic immune system, most of us are saying, well, we're not even sure that exists. And we are at the stage of Thucydides, just noticing things. So, as an infection occurs in your physical immune system, antibodies are released, and notice they rise, they crest, the disease is defeated, and the curve returns back to baseline, homeostasis. Does that, and these are our physical epidemic curves, which we discussed earlier, that they rise, they crest. And so take a look at World War I and World War II. Okay? Very similar curves. They rise, they crest, they go back to remission. So the essential question of this talk, of this book, is just as there is an invisible physical immune system that operates outside of consciousness autonomically, is there an invisible psychic immune system which operates outside of the margins of consciousness or unconsciously? That is the fundamental question of this talk. Okay? And if you conclude there is, that's kind of good news. That's why all these things come to an end. The next segment of this starts to look at another threat to humanity and perhaps to the psychic immune system, and that is nuclear close calls. So we dropped a bomb on Hiroshima and killed 130,000 people, and then on Nagasaki and killed 65,000 people. Those are the only two atomic bombs dropped on population centers. Now, currently, the world possesses 17,000 nuclear weapons. The United States, 7,700, Russia, 8,500, Britain, 225, France, China, India, and Pakistan, and Israel, about 940. All right? That's the world's arsenal. Now, a nuclear winter would likely ensue if 50 of these bombs went off over population centers.
4, 3, 2, 1.
The threat still exists. The possibility that the human species can be destroyed by all-out nuclear war. But this won't happen from the direct impact of hundreds of nuclear weapons raining down on cities around the world, or even the radiation. Instead, total annihilation will come from what follows: a cold, bleak, choking nuclear winter.
So let's talk. That's a little bit scary, but Carl Sagan, who is an astrophysicist, was studying dust storms on Mars and discovered that the dust in the stratosphere blocked out sunlight and made Mars colder than it would otherwise be. Then they started to think, well, what would happen if there was a nuclear war? There would be fires, and they estimated that if there was this is a geophysical research report here, is recent. The number of fires that would be started. Do you remember how the World Trade Center just kept burning and burning and burning for months? Well, if there was a nuclear war over a population center, 1,000 megaton nuclear exchange, the fires that would be estimated would be about the size of Scandinavia. Okay? And so the black soot that would rise into the atmosphere would effectively block out sunlight in the northern hemisphere and reduce temperatures a huge amount. Here's a few video clips on this subject.
Valve spent a good deal of time then looking at the model, trying to make sure the model was behaving properly, to make sure that we understood the reasons for why we were getting these kinds of temperatures.
The results are shown as a graph of temperature against time in days. The horizontal line is freezing point. A few days after the war, the temperature drops rapidly to 23 degrees centigrade below zero. It then recovers over the next 6 months. This graph implied the end of the natural world as we know it.
When we began our work, people thought that nuclear wars would do nothing to the climate, that their effects would be limited to the zone which was actually attacked. Our work was designed to answer the simple question, would there be a large effect on the climate and on people outside the combat zone due to a nuclear war? And these models do suggest very strongly that for a very wide range of possible nuclear wars and for a very wide range of guesses about the things we're not sure about, that there could indeed be very large effects on the atmosphere.
It became important to get some critical assessment and to encourage others to do corroboratory or conflicting calculations. We held a 5-day meeting in Cambridge, Massachusetts in April 1983, involving almost 100 scientists. At my urging, there was a Soviet scientist who attended that meeting.
Following the meeting, new calculations were made at the computing center of the Soviet Academy of Sciences by Vladimir Alexandrov.
The main consequence of the nuclear conflict will be very sharp temperature drop. Can take place in some days, 2, 3, 5 days. And this temperature drop will be very big. We are talking about 20, 40, or 50 degrees centigrade temperature decrease over the territory of the United States, Europe, Soviet Union. And this temperature drop will continue during...
For about 6 months. It is estimated that half the human race would perish in a nuclear winter, mainly from starvation. Okay, so let's move on to, there are a number of nuclear accidents. A plane crashes into a storage facility that houses atomic weapons in the 1960s. There are about 65 or 70 such incidents. I didn't count those incidents in my research because a plane crashing into a bunker or a storage facility setting off a nuclear weapon does not cause World War III or nuclear winter. How many incidents could have caused World War III? And the answer is close to 20. So let's take a look at some of these close calls. On June 30th, 1980, NORAD in Colorado receives a message that 22 Soviet missiles have been launched. And then very shortly after, 222 missiles have been launched. And then shortly thereafter, 2,200. Well, it turns out that was a computer chip error. The chip cost 49 cents, but it could have led to, and people were put on alert. Bombers were readied, okay? In September 1983, the Soviets had established a new early warning system, and it was a person who was monitoring it, and he noticed 5 ICBMs coming towards the Soviet Union from the United States. An all-out attack? And he said, why would a country attack with 5 missiles? That doesn't seem logical. And he didn't tell his superior officer. Okay, his name was Stanislav Petrov. Now, if he had told his superior officer that 5 missiles were coming, the whole Soviet machinery would have probably gone into operation. But he kept his mouth shut. He made his own judgment. And people say they would like to celebrate September 26th as Stanislav Petrov Day because he saved the world from annihilation by simply not telling his superiors. Now, it has been called the most dangerous moment in human history. And you probably know this history, but there's something here that you don't know. So Soviets are sending missiles to Cuba. Kennedy says we can't allow that to happen. He quarantines and blockades Cuba. Kennedy versus Khrushchev. His Secretary of Defense is Robert McNamara. It gets very, very, very tense, and finally the Soviets turn back and retreat. And that's the story everybody was told. Kennedy gets a lot of applause. Khrushchev is the blue meanie. He was removed from power about a year later. But that whole story is what people have absorbed, and it's not particularly true. Here's the truth. In 2000, in the 21st century, a conference is held in Havana. All of the parties from the Cuban Missile Crisis of 40 years earlier meet, and they learn something they never knew before. The Soviets had nuclear-tipped torpedoes in their submarines. We didn't know that. We were dropping depth charges on Soviet submarines and forcing them to the surface, but we didn't know they had nuclear weapons that were armed. Okay? There were three officers, Maslenikov, Savitsky, and Arkhipov. They were out of communication with Russia, with Moscow. They were understanding orders that if you are attacked, use your nuclear-tipped torpedoes. Two of them, Savitsky and Maslenikov, I hope I'm pronouncing that correct, said fire. Okay? Now, if they fired a nuclear-tipped torpedo and destroyed the American Navy, we would have instantly retaliated against Moscow. Moscow would have retaliated against us, and we were that close to World War III. Arkhipov said, don't fire. They said, that's treasonous. We were taught, you're going against standing orders. And Arkhipov said, he stood his ground and said, please do not do this. Okay? Vasily Arkhipov basically saved the world from annihilation.
In October, there was a retrospective meeting, the 40th anniversary meeting of the missile crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. It was attended by key participants, high-level participants in the U.S., Russia, and Cuba. They knew at the time that it was a very dangerous period, the most dangerous moment in history. Kennedy's advisor, Arthur Schlesinger, described it as. What they found out last October just blew their minds. It turned out that the world was literally one word away from what would have been a terminal nuclear war. It was that close, and submarines had been under attack by U.S. destroyers. The submarine commanders thought a war was on, meaning a nuclear war. They had nuclear-tipped missiles, and two of the commanders ordered them sent off, which would have led to a devastating nuclear response, wipe out Moscow. They respond by wiping out New York, and in a couple of minutes it's all over. Why didn't it happen? Well, a third Russian submarine commander countermanded the order. That's why we're around to talk about it. It was that close.
Okay, well, the question I'm raising is, what saved the human race in that 13-day period? Was it rationality and intelligence at play, or was it some hidden protective counterforce that we don't know about? That's a different approach to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, let's take a look at rationality and intelligence. JFK was Harvard educated. He might have been the smartest president in American history. His Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, was known as the whiz kid. He was a genius. Okay? Arkhipov and Savitsky were officers. They were all intelligent and rational men. Okay? And the world, the future of the human race was in the hands of these people. Now, John F. Kennedy did not know there were already nuclear weapons in Cuba. He did not know there was the sub they were dropping depth charges on had nuclear weapons that were ready to be fired. McNamara said drop those depth charges. If they had known that those subs had nuclear missiles, they would have never done that, ever. They would have never taken that risk. They just were ignorant. It wasn't rationality that saved the day. Okay? Something else was at play. All right, another incident here in human history. I ask my students or audiences that I deliver this talk to, how many of you know what able archer is? And I would say 1, maybe 2 out of every 100 people know what able archer was. Able archer was the closest America ever came to being destroyed. We were within 8 minutes of our own annihilation, and we don't even know about the incident. So, here's a
The
little
pride of
clip.
Reagan's arms buildup was a new medium-range nuclear missile to be introduced into Europe in November 1983. It was called Pershing II, and its imminent arrival unnerved the Soviet military. The pride of Reagan's arms buildup was a new medium-range nuclear missile to be introduced into Europe in November 1983. It was called Pershing II, and its imminent arrival unnerved the Soviet military.
The really dangerous thing was that the flight time of these missiles was only 6 to 8 minutes, which allowed the Americans to inflict a sudden nuclear strike and decapitate the Soviet Union. That is, to destroy the leadership inside the Kremlin. Launching a counter-strike would have been almost impossible.
The stakes were enormous.
Remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
This speech was designed to offend the Kremlin, and it did.
When he called the Soviet Union the evil empire, the Soviet leadership was shocked and said, we are to expect something terrible from this reckless president.
Evil empire, evil empire.
That all made the Soviets feel that something is really brewing and they have to be ready for a nuclear attack.
Evil empire, evil empire, evil empire.
So let's gather this in. We had put Pershing missiles in Europe, which could hit Moscow in 8 minutes. And then Able Archer was a computer simulation of World War III. That's all it was. It was a computer game. And the people came to work from 9 to 5. They did it 6 or 7 days. And the people in the West, that is Europe, and the United States and NATO thought, it's just an exercise, it's not a big deal. But they wanted to make it as realistic as possible. So they had secret communication, tried to make it to simulate a realism. Now, the Soviets are reacting to a few things. One, they're having an exercise, really? How do we know it's an exercise rather than the real thing? Ronald Reagan is the president, and he seems to be mentally ill or certainly reckless in calling us the evil empire. And third, they have just put in missiles that can accomplish a first strike in 8 minutes. We have to be prepared. And so from the Soviet point of view, there were massive preparations for real nuclear war.
We were ready for the Third World War, if the Americans started it.
Waste it. And they will just string us up. He's anti-communist. He says it is an evil empire. He will string us up or just destroy us in our bunkers.
In the imaginary war game of Able Archer, the script had reached the final page. Having obtained permission to use nuclear weapons, the nuclear commandos now had to wait the whole night before they were allowed to press the button.
By the time the exercise came to its fruition, it would have gone nuclear, and there's a kind of wave of rising interest and enthusiasm. When it had gone critical, we were asking for nuclear release, bang, and we can all go home.
We expected that at precisely that moment, the Americans might unleash the Third World War. When we reached the command bunker that night, we received a special order. We were told to immediately go to raised combat alert. It was so serious, there was a third man there with us to maintain uninterrupted communications.
Unseen by watching American satellites, over 300 intercontinental ballistic missiles prepared for a massive retaliatory strike.
The strategic nuclear forces secretly, I emphasize that it was secretly, went up to increased combat readiness.
Under my command were 10 intercontinental ballistic missiles. On each missile there were 10 warheads. Each of these was aimed at a particular city, like Washington, New York, Philadelphia, and so on. The targeting was very, very precise. The devastation would have been total.
Each missile had the force of 150 Hiroshimas. And these were not the only nuclear forces preparing for war. Unseen by the West, 75 SS-20s had also dispersed into the field. Back in the nuclear vault of Able Archer, the mood could not have been more different.
I can see no reason why it would have alarmed the Soviets at all. They held their own exercises. They went through exactly the same sort of procedures as we did. Just a paper exercise, a command post exercise.
This was not how the Soviets saw it. In Soviet Russia, 3 men had the authority to launch nuclear weapons. Besides Andropov, both the defense minister and the head of the army held chegets, a Soviet equivalent to the nuclear football. These contained the launch codes to the nuclear weapons.
In the background of 1983 and the level of tensions, they really were, I think, concerned that maybe the United States was getting ready to strike.
At dawn the following day, the Soviets intercepted the NATO signal that nuclear missiles had been launched.
We were waiting for the one most important order. That is the order to open the safe with launch codes. When you open that document, your hands are shaking. It is the most terrifying thing. But we knew that if we had received the order, American missiles were already flying towards us.
The targets had been chosen. The coded messages had been sent. But the missiles remained nothing more than pieces of paper in a war game. On the last morning, 350 imaginary nuclear weapons were launched at targets in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And then, quite suddenly, the exercise ended.
The most terrifying thing about Able Archer was that we may have been at the brink of nuclear war and not even known it.
So that indeed was a very dangerous moment. Those Soviet missiles were primed, ready to go. All that was necessary was one person to say, launch. If they had made a mistake and they thought that those missiles had actually been activated, and instead of being an exercise, it was really a ruse to have a first strike against the Soviet Union, which is what they were prepared for, 300 nuclear weapons would have been delivered or more against the United States. So the world came very close to a nuclear winter there. Now, there were 20 such incidents, not all that severe, that are discussed in my book. So McNamara in the Cuban Missile Crisis said, we were that close. It was just a matter of luck. So I thought, was it just a matter of luck? If you flip a coin and heads says no nuclear war, and you get 20 heads in a row, what's the chances that you can get 20 heads in a row? Well, that's 1,000,000 to 1 to get 20 heads in a row. So it doesn't look like it was luck that saved the human race. In addition, besides those 20 incidents, General Douglas MacArthur asked Harry Truman to use nuclear weapons against Korea. General Arthur Radford asked Eisenhower for permission to use nuclear weapons in Berlin. General Curtis LeMay asked John Kennedy twice for permission to use nuclear weapons. Fidel Castro asked the Soviets to attack the United States with nuclear weapons. Richard Nixon was thinking of using them in North Vietnam. Cheney wanted to at least studied the possibility of using nuclear weapons against Iran. Now, that's just stuff that we know. How many Russian generals urged their premier to have a first strike? Or Chinese generals? We don't even know about that history. So what if there were not 20 incidents, but 25 incidents? And that's a pretty conservative assumption, if you think about it. That there were, in fact, at least 25 incidents where the human race came close to nuclear war. What is the probability of throwing heads 25 times in a row? Well, that's 33 million to 1. So it's not luck. The human race did not luck out. Something else is operating. So the doomsday clock, if you're familiar with it, a bulletin of atomic physicists have a doomsday clock, which they set. And the number of times it's been 5 minutes before midnight, meaning the world is in a very precipitous, dangerous time. It has occurred 1949 to 1960, 81 to 88, 2007 to 2009. 20 of the last 66 years, or 30% of the time since 1947, the doomsday clock has been set at 5 minutes before midnight. It's currently set at 3 minutes before midnight as I speak. Okay, so think about it. Of the 20 or 25 let's think of all these incidents as fevers. The human race had a fever. 3 serious fevers, 13 severe fevers, and it was in critical condition 4 times since World War II. Okay? Now, what causes a fever to break? That's the issue that we're thinking about. It isn't rationality. It isn't luck. Maybe there is a counterforce that is operating behind the scenes that we do not see, the same way the immune system operates behind the scenes. We don't see, well, we can see that the cut in our hand is healing, but we don't feel and see, and we're not conscious of the actions of the human immune system. Is there a psychic immune system that is an antidote to these eruptions of violence and barbarity and insanity and miscalculation? It's not luck. It's not rationality. Is it God? Does God have our back? Well, if you're a religious person, you could actually take this evidence and go in that direction, because there is strong evidence that something seems to have humanity's back. And I'm a social scientist. I can't go there. But I think there may be a collective self-preservative instinct, like a psychic immune system, that is the counterforce that we are looking at, that is hidden from our consciousness. I wrote this book that we've been talking about. It's called The Psychic Immune System, A Hidden Epiphenomena of the Body's Own Defenses. And it'll be published in January, February, or March of 2016. So part 2 of this talk and of the book is called Epiphenomena, a glimpse into the hidden world of the psychic immune system. Now, the word epiphenomena means essentially that there's another reality that exists parallel to the reality that you're familiar with. That's something that is sort of like behind the scenes. And the idea is that the psychic immune system mimics the physical immune system and exists in a kind of parallel reality to it. What makes up the psychic immune system? That was the task. What kind of things? What are the constituents of this mysterious hidden thing? Well, this is where we take a look at, once again, that hidden reality. Step back and you see it, and hopefully we'll bring what is embedded out into the open, at least a little bit. So we begin with the idea of self-preservative reflexes. We have some physical self-preservative reflexes and some psychological ones. If, for example, you touch a hot object or a very cold object, you have almost a spinal reflex. You just immediately drop the object before you suffer third-degree burns, okay? If you're driving a car, and sometimes you just put on the brakes automatically and scream, maybe, but you do this almost at an instinctual level. Even before you know what the danger is consciously, you have already reacted. That last one was a psychological thing, right? That's fear. Now, when a baby cries, there's studies have been done by social psychologists and neuropsychologists that a baby's cry, masked against white noise, is reacted to by a woman much faster than by a man. Okay? In fact, a woman's brain lights up in 100 milliseconds after this baby cries. That's the amount of time it takes to blink. Okay? And she reacts. The husband, the male, I mean, even women who are not mothers react this way. So that is a self-preservative reflex. That child and her mother, its mother, are connected. And this child is wired to its food supply. Self-preservation reflexes happen often independently of our conscious mind.
See? We're just tossing. He's not blinking. Do you see that? Are you filming?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're just tossing. And he flinches.
These are built-in reflexes. Now, if we look at the physical immune system, we've learned this in the last 130, 40 years. These are the organs of the physical immune system: the tonsils, the lymph nodes, the thymus gland. Okay, so we know how the physical immune system works. We really don't know how the psychic immune system works. So the question we ask, is there a psychic immune system that parallels our physical immune system? The physical immune system fights off infections, viruses, bacteria, cancer, contagions, plagues. Does the psychic immune system exist that wards off or is a counterforce against genocides, tyranny, war, barbarism, violence, enmity, and evil? So that's the task that has been set before us. Now, Freud actually had a concept that was similar to the psychic immune system. He called it eros. He was close, but he never got too close to it. But he did hint at it. Carl Jung hinted at it too with his concept of archetypes in the collective unconscious. So we do have some forerunners here who deserve some credit. Now, if you look at the psychic immune system as an epiphenomenon, as a mirror image, then the physical immune system has three components: innate, adaptive, and artificial immune system. As an epiphenomena, then, we would look at the psychic immune system as having innate, adaptive, and artificial elements. Now, I'm not going to spend the whole talk here talking about all this meaty subject matter in the center of this book, but if we look at the innate, adaptive, and conscious dimensions, when I say conscious dimension, I mean the artificial dimension. That's what artificial means here. That's a term immunologists use. So we're looking at evolutionary biology, epigenetics, social psychology, sociogenomics, sociobiology, evolutionary psychology. So we're looking at a lot of very au courant disciplines. Now, the constituents. What are the constituents of the psychic immune system? Well, here are some that I have discerned: territoriality, incest avoidance, competition, fight-flight reflexes, kin selection, inclusive fitness, altruism, cooperation, and reciprocal altruism, and nonviolence. These are not all, but these are some of the things that are talked about that are part of our psychic means of defending ourselves against danger and threat. So let's take just a few examples to get a feeling for this. One example of the innate psychic immune system might be incest avoidance. Strangely enough, Freud talked about incest and the Oedipus complex, but that was 100 years ago, actually. And there are a lot of discoveries since that time. So social psychologists sometimes are brilliant. So they decided to try one experiment in which they took the scents of males, okay, and they had pubescent girls smell these scents for how noxious they were or how alluring they were. And they discovered that a pubescent girl finds the odors of her father and her brothers most toxic, most noxious, and the odors of strangers more attractive. That same experiment has been done with boys, mothers, and sisters. It does not work with same-sex siblings. It works with opposite-sex siblings. So you think, well, what does that mean? That means there's a built-in innate aversion to attraction to your first-order relatives. Okay? Now, if you look at what happens if there is a mating, and this happens in the animal kingdom too, something I don't think Freud was that aware of. The consequences of first-order incest, that is, of mother, son, father, daughter, result in offspring who have all sorts of problems. About 40% of these births have something like infertility or cleft palate, facial disfigurement, cardiac conditions, cystic fibrosis, albinism, sickle cell anemia, mental disability. It's called genetic homozygosity, which is it's a pretty bad thing. And animals, primates particularly, only about 5% of primate matings may be called first-order incest. There's a built-in aversion towards it. And that seems to be a phylogenetic survival mechanism. I mean, it's when you are mating with strangers or people outside of that early unit, you find the genetic diversity is improved, not worsened. Okay, here's another example of the psychic immune system, kin selection and inclusive fitness, a very interesting concept. We thought when two alpha males are fighting, this fight over territory is really a fighting over breeding rights, and the strongest will win and spread his genes, and therefore the stronger genetic winner will survive into the future. Hamilton in the 60s said, it's not really a single male competing with another. It's a set of genes competing against another set of genes. So he came up with the idea of kin selection, that animals who have similar genes stay together, coalesce together, aggregate together, defend each other more than animals who have further genetic similarities or dissimilarities. For example, birds, stepmother or mothers, granddaughters, sisters tend to care for the young and nurture them. But the more distant genetic relationship, the caregiving falls off. So similar kin fight for each other and defend each other. And it's a kind of a, here are some examples. In the animal kingdom, here's a dog fell into a pool, and the mother dog tries to save its life. So similar kin, evolutionary biologists argue, that is, kin with the genetic similarity, tend to have a protective, defensive relationship to one another, and this happens with human beings too. Human beings often organize themselves according to kinship. It's not just culture and language, but it's also genetic similarity that brings them together in enclaves like Little Italy, Little Saigon, Chinatown, and uh, these organizations, the tendency is for people to aggregate with their closer kin. And there's a genetic basis for this, not just a cultural basis for it. Now, there's a third example of that kind of follows this, the idea of selfish genes, reciprocal altruism, and the golden rule. We think that the golden rule, do unto others as you would do unto yourself, is a religious value, but it's really found in the animal kingdom all over the place. It's called reciprocal altruism.
The survival of the fittest really means the survival of genes, because it is only genes that really survive down through many generations. A gene that didn't look after its own interests would not survive. That's the meaning of the phrase, selfish gene. Okay, so how can selfish genes support kindness? If genes are striving selfishly to make more copies of themselves, how can a gene achieve this selfish objective by making its bearer behave altruistically? One part of the answer is kinship. An altruistic gene can spread through the population so long as the altruism is directed at other organisms that have the same gene. In other words, at family. So, selfish genes build parent animals who protect their young. In human terms, parents who'd rush into a burning building to save their children. This is called kin selection. The other part of the answer is reciprocal altruism. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. When animals live in groups where they encounter each other repeatedly, genes for returning favors can survive. Individuals sacrifice themselves for each other. They give food to each other, to close kin, and to other individuals who might be in a position to pay back favors on another occasion. Selfish genes give rise to altruistic individuals.
So let's follow this argument a little further. You'll see examples in the animal kingdom of reciprocal altruism, of an individual not just helping its own kin, but helping a non-kin. And there's a whole area which is called peace ethology, which talks about the prolific nature of cooperation, kindness, nonviolence in the animal kingdom. We were watching far too many videos about sharks attacking other sharks and people, and the level of affiliative, cooperative, kind behavior in the animal kingdom is really much greater than our survival of the fittest school has had led us to believe. We're not disputing Darwin here. We're just complementing it with another aspect. So So we see a few examples of the golden rule of reciprocal altruism, and biologists have attempted to explain how that might work. And it's basically you scratch my back, I scratch yours. There is affiliative, cooperative behavior in the animal kingdom and in the human landscape. So let's take another look at cooperation, empathy, altruism, being nice, with a curious experiment with chimpanzees done way back in 1937.
This is a very old video from the Turkish Primate Center where they trained chimpanzees to cooperate. So this is already about 100 years ago that we were doing experiments on cooperation. And what you have here is two young chimpanzees who have a box, and the box is too heavy for one chimp to pull in. And of course there's food on the box, otherwise they wouldn't be pulling so hard. And so they're bringing in the box. And you can see that they're synchronized. You can see that they work together. They pull at the same moment. It's already a big advance over many other animals who wouldn't be able to do that. And now you're going to get a more interesting picture, because now one of the two chimps has been fed. So one of the two is not really interested in the task anymore.
Goes the curtain. And Wynne is part of a new wave of researchers who have discovered seemingly simple ways to probe what's really going on in those adorable little heads.
Up goes the curtain.
We watched as Wynne and her team asked a question that 20 years ago might have gotten her laughed out of her field. Does Wesley here, at the ripe old age of 5 months, know the difference between right and wrong? Wesley watches as the puppet in the center struggles to open up a box with a toy inside. The puppy in the yellow shirt comes over and lends a hand. Then the scene repeats itself, but this time the puppy in the blue shirt comes and slams the box shut. Nice behavior? Mean behavior. At least to our eyes. But is that how a 5-month-old sees it? And does he have a preference?
Leslie, do you remember these guys from the show?
To find out, a researcher who doesn't know which puppet was nice and which was mean offers Wesley a choice.
Who do you like?
He can't answer, but he can reach.
That one.
Wesley chose the good guy, and he wasn't alone.
That one.
More than 3/4 of the babies tested reached for the nice puppet.
That one.
Wynne tried it out on even younger babies, 3-month-olds, who can't control their arms enough to reach. But they can vote with their eyes, since research has shown that even very young babies look longer at things they like.
Which one do you like?
Daisy here looked at the mean puppet for 5 seconds, then switched to the nice one for 33.
Babies, even at 3 months, looked towards the nice character and looked hardly at all, much shorter times, towards the unhelpful character.
So basically, as young as 3 months old, we human beings show a preference for nice people over mean people.
So you could probably at this time say, what are you talking about? What does this have to do with the psychic immune system? So let's review, okay? What does a young girl finding her brother's odor more noxious than a stranger have to do with the psychic immune system? Well, it means that she's wired to avoid, to have a preference for non-kin, non-first order kin. And that's a psychological aversion, and it's a self-preservative, phylogenetically self-preservative mechanism. It's protective. What does a woman's ability to hear a child cry more easily than a man have to do with the psychic immune system? Well, the child is wired to its food supply, and it is a self-preservative wiring. It brings food when it's needed. What does kin selection and inclusive fitness have to do? Fighting for your own kind, what does that have to do with the psychic immune system? Because similar kin protect, defend, fight for each other. for similar aggregates of individuals. Okay? That's a protective mechanism. What does reciprocal altruism, an innate instinct towards cooperation, compassion, or helping strangers have anything to do with the psychic immune system? It creates a nonviolent atmosphere of kindness, cooperation, and affiliative behavior, which is protective. Okay, yes, but is it all unconscious, autonomic, and hardwired? Well, I'm glad you asked. Okay, because so far, everything we've talked about seems to be kind of built into the system. Well, do you remember we talked about the artificial physical immune system? What is that? That's a term immunologists use. Artificial means conscious, deliberate, purposive strategies for boosting and improving the immune system. Okay? And here's where consciousness enters into the equation. For example, vaccinations, quarantines, sanitation, antibiotics, all those things are consciously manipulated mechanisms we use to improve our immune system. We vaccinate against polio, measles, smallpox. We've known about the immune system for 130 years, but do you realize in that time, human life expectancy has almost doubled because of the power of vaccinations, quarantines, sanitation, antibiotics, medicine? All of that is basically conscious, deliberate, artificial things. Those things are not built into our physical immune system. We're improving our immune system. Take a look at Ebola as a good example. 30% of people who are infected with Ebola, 30% die. That is an extremely virulent disease. If we didn't have an artificial immune system and Ebola just was allowed to spread across the world, 2.1 billion human beings would die. 30% of the human race. Okay? But we have a conscious system in place too, and we wear masks and we quarantine areas, and when someone flies from that area of Africa, they are stopped at the airport and quarantined, and every person they know is interviewed and hospitalized and watched. Burial practices are changed, and the total number of people who died from Ebola is only 7,400, not 2.1 billion. That's to the credit of the artificial immune system. Now, we also have an artificial psychic immune system. If it's an epiphenomena and it's mimicking that, then we use conscious, deliberate strategies to protect human beings and ensure safety. Not built in, hardwired, but consciously decided and deliberated. What are you talking? Well, look, parents, families, school bus drivers are certified. They're there to protect children. Schools have all sorts of mechanisms to protect children. Fire drills, teachers, police, fire departments. There are all sorts of parts of the social order that are predicated on human survival and protection. That includes the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the National Guard. In every society, we have these social entities that exist for protection. The OSHA, FAA, FBI, TS, when you try to say how big is the artificial psychic immune system, is almost inestimable in size. When there's a plane crash, the FAA investigates why? To prevent further crashes, to protect people. So the whole idea of the psychic immune system, the artificial psychic immune system, is to protect, to defend, to react to danger and threat. And that is our system. Nonetheless, that these may be constituents of the psychic immune system, we have to admit a few things. First of all, we still know very little about it. Two, very few psychologists are working in this area. There are a few, perhaps a handful. We don't know really how it works. We kind of tried to guess at some of the constituents of it. We don't know when it works. Is it working now? Most of the time we don't even see it in operation. But like Thucydides, remember him? He noticed something. He noticed the effects of the immune system. He didn't know what to call it, but he noticed if somebody got sick, they didn't get sick the second time. But there was some invisible internal thing that took 100 years before people called it an immune system. But Thucydides at least recognized its effects. And we, in this exercise and in this book, are recognizing these effects. I was in Auschwitz, okay? There were lots of tourists there. I didn't see one person smiling. This is the epitome of human evil. This is about 472-acre site in which 1 million people were murdered, okay? There is probably no piece of real estate on planet Earth which hosted more human darkness and human evil than Auschwitz. I don't think you can find another 500-acre site that can make those claims, all right? And yet, Auschwitz was not open for a century or for decades. It shut down rather rapidly. Something shut it down, okay? Cambodia, Pol Pot killed almost more than 20% of the population of his country, murdered them, okay? It didn't go on for centuries. It shut down in about 3 years. Something stopped it. Stalin's gulags, not just the Holodomor, but his gulags took the lives of almost 1.5 million people, okay? Gradually, that horror story had a conclusion. It came to an end. It was stopped in its tracks. The famine of Mao's collectivization of Chinese agriculture and the consequent famine that came ended. The Soviet Able Archer episode, which brought us 8 minutes from our own annihilation, ended happily. African slavery came to an end with the abolition of slavery. All of these human diseases, epidemics, and dark periods come to an end. They all seem to have happy endings. And we haven't really paid that much attention to the fact that things seem to be always working towards good and kindness and peace and nonviolence. So when a mother has a child and the child has a cold and she rubs Vicks Vapo Rub on the child and keeps him home from school, could the mother say, "Oh, I cured my child of a cold"? No. If that child did not have an immune system, that child would be dead no matter what you did. There are children who have been born without immune systems. They have to live in a plastic bubble. Without an immune system working behind the scenes, all of your efforts would be meaningless. So why don't we think that we have a psychic immune system that is operating behind the scenes in the same way? We have a conscious-centric bias. We think that our great leaders, Churchill, Patton, Zhukov in Russia, they're the ones who stopped Hitler. They're the ones who ended World War II. They're our heroes. Yes, we have heroes who bring peace, who we admire for their nonviolent nature. But to say that they are the people who brought nonviolence and peace is like the mother saying, "I cured my kid of that cold." Okay, it ignores something. Could we say that it was rational, intelligent, well-meaning people who saved the world every time from the darkness of the human condition? John F. Kennedy was a rational, intelligent, well-meaning person. He was battle-tested. He didn't want to go. He didn't want our troops to go into Vietnam. He was trying to pull them out, okay? He was not a warmonger. And he was probably the most intelligent president and most dispassionate president in American history. And yet he and Robert McNamara together almost destroyed the world. We could add Khrushchev in there, but it was primarily the fact that he was dropping depth charges on submarines of the Soviet Union that had nuclear weapons on them that brought us so close to our own annihilation. So it's not rational, intelligent heroes who save the world. Okay, that's a comic book interpretation of history. It's something else, the counterforce. And I'm proposing the psychic immune system is that force. It is a cooperative, affiliative force that unites human beings, that brings human beings together, that connects human beings in ways that we have no idea, in which there is a collective, almost universal, ubiquitous desire for peace, for nonviolence, cooperative behavior, which is underemphasized in our media and in our lives. But there is a protective counterforce that surrounds the human landscape, which is in fact very, very, very good news and brings us a sense of optimism that all the darkness we see in our world will ultimately be conquered. It always has. Think of it as Gandhi said. Think of it always. So that's a wonderful theory, isn't it? Very optimistic, a positive theory. But it's just a theory. All we have basically are correlations. Physical diseases go up and come down. Psychic epidemics go up and come down. That's correlational. It's nice, interesting symmetries, but a theory is just a theory. It has to be tested. How do you test the theory of the psychic immune system? Okay, that is our next question. When you test a hypothesis, there's the hypothesis and then there's the null hypothesis or the alternate hypothesis. So there is a psychic immune system or there isn't. Now, to test it, we need to know what is a dilemma, a threat to the human race that exists, that we created, that threatens humanity. And will we be rescued by the psychic immune system or will we be left to our own devices? So there is something right on the horizon right now, and it's called global warming. All right, it is a real threat. It is man-made. It threatens our planet. It threatens us. So it's a great litmus test of whether or not there could be a psychic immune system. So if you look at the North Pole in 1979 summer versus the summer of 2003 and the summer of 2010, obviously something's going on. A picture is worth 1,000 words. There's a huge amount of denial in the United States from Fox News, Bill O'Reilly, Glenn Beck, Rick Santorum, that it's all a hoax, that it doesn't exist, and 25 to 30% of the American population has fallen for that. They think it's either a hoax or it's not a serious issue. Okay, 2% of Canadians feel that way. The media propaganda on this issue is really quite thick. There have been twice as many record highs as record lows in the last decade. Now, if there's a low in Wyoming, Fox News says, see, how could you have a record low and still talk about global warming? Look at the snow in Boston. You know, those are anecdotal, ridiculous arguments that the record lows are outnumbered by the record highs for a long period of time. Of 1,372 PhDs, 97% say global warming is real and man-made. 20,000 articles were reviewed by the UN. It's a reality. The CO2 levels in Mauna Loa, Hawaii, were measured at 401 parts per million in 2015. That's the highest level of CO2 in 650,000 years. And that data that has been corroborated with at least 2 different studies. So it is really a serious matter. Now, it is alleged that the summer ice cap in the Arctic will be gone in 2020. Okay? Now, if that's the case, that'll be the first time in 125,000 years humans have lived on this planet where there wasn't an ice cap at the North Pole. So if we date the catastrophic side of global warming to begin in 2020, that'll be the time that we should say, well, is the psychic immune system coming to our rescue or not? Humanity effectively is driving itself over a cliff as we speak. Oxfam predicts 100 million people will die from global warming in the next 15 years. Okay? That's almost twice the level of human carnage as World War II. So we would expect the psychic immune system to have something to say, to be getting started, to get whatever its magic is to start moving along in dealing with this coming catastrophe. So it's either there or it isn't. Great experimental tests. The laboratory is planet Earth. If there's no psychic immune system, we can expect what Oxfam predicts, and we can expect catastrophes beyond our imagination that come from this phenomenon. We have never been here before. On the other hand, if there is a psychic immune system, we talk in the book about the archetype of the hero. Einstein writes to Roosevelt in 1939 and says, I think we could build an atomic bomb. Well, from 1939 to 1945, that was a done deal. Okay? Oppenheimer and Einstein worked for us, not the Nazis. Okay? So there is a good possibility that one aspect of the psychic immune system is the archetype of the hero, that we will invent our way to some extent out of this dilemma with new technologies that will replace the fossil fuels that we are currently spewing into the atmosphere. So that is one element of what the psychic immune system can be expected to do. But there is a deeper, more unconscious, autonomic element, and that is the galvanizing of human resolve and human opinion. That is a demonstration in Japan over the nuclear accidents in Fukushima. All right, we can expect human involvement in demonstrations, insurgency, militancy, 100 times greater than that, 100 times greater than the Arab Spring, a contagion that affects the human race and is resolved not to destroy our habitat. Okay, so we should expect a huge upswell in harmony, in mutual cooperative affiliative behavior, and transpersonal connections between human beings. We don't understand how the psychic immune system entirely works, but we do know that it will unite members of our species, okay, in a way which we have not known, a kind of grassroots militancy that our media doesn't even talk about today, but what the psychic immune system would clearly predict. So take a look at World War II as an example. Humanity was resolved, and the American population and the Russian population too were deeply committed to overthrowing the threat that was faced. We didn't have 1943 or 42 Buicks that were made in Detroit. We made tanks, okay? We produced 260,000 military aircraft in the space of a few years. We can expect all of that and more when the trigger has been pulled, the grassroots revolution when it comes to how human beings are going to react to their own destruction of their habitat. And that is what we should expect, and that's what we would predict. If you go back to the early table that I showed you at the beginning of this talk, the average length of time for the dark periods that appear in the human condition is about 37 years. From Genghis Khan to Pol Pot, some are 3 years, some are 80 years, but the average is 37 years. So if we date the period of time the psychic immune system needs to bring this threat under control, it should be about 37 years. Okay, from 2020, 37 years out, the global warming issue should come under control. Now, there's a wide standard deviation in this area, so we might go out as long as the entire 21st century. But the theory of the psychic immune system is that this will be stopped, this will be solved, and this will restore our planet to its integrity and will bring us down to homeostasis. The curve will come down, and humanity will reintegrate itself with its planet and its habitat and save itself, because it's all inside of us that this flower blossoms. And that is a very optimistic message. So, thank you very much for watching.